Hey everybody, I'm Mike Lombardi. I'm a software engineer by day at Puppet. I'm a tabletop game developer by night. Wrapped up a Kickstarter a little while ago. It turns out running the Kickstarter is the easy part. Wrangling 21 artists is hard if you think wrangling engineers is hard. So today I'm going to talk to you about Dungeons & Dragons in development, why I think that playing tabletop role-playing games is going to help make you a better engineer, or an operator, or a tester, or an accountant. So today we're going to talk a little bit about Dungeons & Dragons. So when I say dungeons, what I want you to think about is dungeons as a metaphor for a place that we go to solve problems and get money, right? Like when we go into dungeons, there are problems that are in our way, right? And we want to get back out with that filthy, filthy lucre. We want cash monies. Organizations that we work at are kind of also the same thing. Like we go to solve problems and get out with money. I think it's a pretty good parallel. Not that you should tell your boss that you work in a dungeon. That probably won't go over well. The next thing we're going to talk about are dragons. So dragons you should think of as the problems to be overcome, right? In this little two-system thing, you've got places to go to solve problems, or organizations in which to solve problems, and then the specific problems themselves are the dragons. So we're going to talk a lot today about skills. In tabletop, we talk a lot about player skill versus character skill. What we're going to talk about today is we're going to try to map that to meta skills and technical skills. So they map almost directly in that vertical. Player skills are meta skills. Character skills are loosely analogous to technical skills. So technical skills are the things that your character is really good at doing, right? Like how many people here can throw a fireball? 1, 2. So talk to the wizards in the back. They've got some interesting things to teach us. But similarly, like we're not very good at sword fighting, presumably, but your character might be, right? So it's the things that your character can be good at that you probably can't be or aren't, right? Versus player skills, which are the things that it's hard to represent on a character sheet, but it's easy for a person to do. Easy, I shouldn't have said that, that's not true at all. They're hard, because they're skills. But we're gonna get into all of those today. The thing to keep in mind, though, is that these meta skills, these player skills, these are the foundation that are going to let everything else you do, all your technical competencies, really shine through and make you successful over the course of your career. And the other point I want to make today is that without the solid meta skills, you're always going to underperform yourself, right? You're never, ever going to reach your potential if you don't shore these up. So what are these meta skills? Well, systems mastery, communication, empathy, collaboration, resource management, and lateral thinking. That's a lot of words. Don't worry, that's what we're going to cover for the next 45 minutes. So let's talk first about systems mastery. So what is up on screen right now is the character sheet for a game called Dungeon Crawl Classics, as it says right at the top. This is everything that you need to have captured for your character. Systems mastery is your knowledge of and ability to exploit a given system, including its rules, conditions, context, supporting components. So the thing to note there is the exploit piece, right? So the more you know a system, the more you can leverage that knowledge of the system to do something you want to do with it. Exploits are not necessarily negative. Let's talk about this in terms of the game. This is Advanced Dungeons & Dragons. It's the player's handbook. This contains all of the known and shared rules across tables. This is the rules, the mechanics, the guidelines, the tools that you need for playing. Everything that you need to play Dungeons & Dragons is in this book. There's a lot of other books too, but this is like there's only maybe 30 pages in there that you actually need to play. The thing to keep in mind is that no matter what system you're engaging with, some mastery is required to be effective, right? But you don't need to know this whole thing front to back to be good at playing D&D, right? That's not the case. You can get really, really good at playing with all the other skills. This just allows you to exploit the system. And the thing to note about system mastery is it's always opt-in. No one can make you master a system, right? Nobody can force you to really grok something, pull it in and find the exploits. It's just something you have to choose to do yourself. So, good. Let's talk about examples of what system mastery in tabletop looks like. So for those of you who can't read the tagline there, it says, kill the monsters, steal the treasure, stab your buddy. Munchkin is a term that we use inside of the community that kind of means somebody who takes systems mastery to a bit of a far level and kind of turns it into being a dick. So they know the rules really well, and they can leverage them against other players and against the person who's running the game, the referee. This can feel a lot like rules lawyering or guardhouse lawyering, depending on where you're from in the world, how you call it. But the thing to keep in mind is that it's not actually inherently negative. The ability to exploit the system, to know how these things work, isn't inherently negative. It's how you apply it that can be a problem. So the example I want to give you today is the peasant railgun. So in the 3rd edition of Dungeons & Dragons, there was a confluence of rules that created a problem. So you could pass an item to somebody else as a free action. In combat, time breaks down into 6-second chunks for reasons that's not important. But the point is that you could do a free action, it's no problem, right? Every time you do a free action, that thing happens, technically takes up no time at all. So a clever and enterprising person will hire 2,280 peasants. You'll put them in a single file. That's about 4.3 miles long. And then what you do is you get a 10-foot pole, preferably made of iron or something like that, something heavy that can withstand the strain you're about to put on it. And then you have them all ready actions. So what you're going to have is the person at the front of the line is going to be ready to throw that 10-foot pole forward, and everybody at the back line is just going to pass the pole up, right? So if we do a little bit of physics, what we find is you've passed that pole 4.3 miles in under 6 seconds, which is a little bit over 5,000 miles per hour, which is roughly Mach 7. You can reload and fire every other round. So as you might guess, very few things will withstand a steel rod thrown through them at about Mach 7. Now, there are some defenses in the system against this, right? So the referee can just say, no, you can't do that. Alternatively, you might be responsible for the care and feeding and management of 2,280 peasants. And for those of you who haven't played D&D, micromanagement, the game, is not a lot of fun. You might not want to do that. Also, if you don't think you have to micromanage peasants, you might be wrong. Especially if you're trying to pull this on me as a ref. So that's Munchkins. Like, that's kind of the idea. Is like you can find exploits in the system and then really abuse them. So how does this apply to work? So at work, kind of like Dungeons & Dragons, we have organizations and operations, right? There's a lot of examples of systems that we work within that we don't really think about very much, right? So there are playbooks, and there's documentation, and there's standard operating procedures. That is the explicit systems that we have available to us in addition to the technical ones underneath, right? So your domains, your networks, and all that sort of thing. So those explicit systems, if you understand how they work, you understand how you can get around them if you're being naughty, or if you have to, right? But you also understand how you can get other people onboarded to them. The more you understand those systems, the more that you can use them effectively. There's also implicit systems. There's workflows, there's organizational practices and hierarchies. So here's the thing. Who here has a cab? You have to go through a change advisory board to get something done, right? Who here loves the process of getting the cab to agree with them? You love the process.
Because I'm the manager and the one leading the cab.
Okay, see, there you go, yeah.
I get it because they pretty much said, oh, whatever.
Yeah, well, that's also one way to do change advisory boards too. So here's the thing. Every cab is a system, right? The people who agree whether or not something goes through, what the conditions are that'll get something approved. Often we work with somebody who has an unspoken veto, right? There's a senior technical architect in your organization, and if they don't agree with the change, it's never going to go forward no matter how sound it is because you haven't got them to buy in. Once you understand that about the system, you go talk to that architect first, right? Because if you can't get them to buy in now, why even take it to the cab, right? It's just going to be sitting in there for 2 hours explaining yourself for nothing.
Or you wait for the guy to not be there.
Right, yeah, or you wait for him to go on vacation and then just shove it all in. That's also a way to exploit the system, right? So the systems mastery is part of that. There's also the example of getting budget for training and conferences. So I know a few people in here are responsible for that or have a really hard time getting that. A lot of the time, the problem is that there's a system in place that we may not know very well, which is how do they decide how to allocate that money and whether or not to approve or deny your request to go to a conference. If you understand what they're deciding based on, you can take that information and then provide them with it, right? You can tool how you discuss those things to the information that the system requires. And this makes things a lot easier. A lot of times as engineers, we forget to do this, right? We think, well, it's obvious, right? We go to the PowerShell Summit to go to sessions, right? And it's just in terms of like explaining to them what that value looks like. So there's also communication, right? This is our next skill. So it's your ability to clearly and concisely synthesize information. It's those three things that are super important, right? If you can explain something but you ramble all the time and you tell like a 35-minute story to get it out, it's not clear, it's not concise, it's hard to get that information back out. But equally important as being able to give information to people is to be able to take that information and do something useful with it, which is synthesis. So in Dungeons & Dragons, we have what's referred to as intent and approach, right? Also, I keep saying Dungeons & Dragons. This applies across all of tabletop, fundamentally. So intent is what it is you want to do, right? What you want to accomplish, the end state that you want for the world. And the approach is how you want to fulfill that intent, what you're going to try to do to make that happen. So this comes back to clarity and shared fictional modeling. So when you're playing Dungeons & Dragons or another tabletop game, you are working together in a fictional world that none of you can see, none of you can feel, taste, touch, smell, and you have to share the context well enough that you can make good decisions in that context. That means that communication is a critical skill to this, right? So if I describe a door as being locked and you say, okay, I picked the lock, I was like, no, I meant like a vault door, like it's like you can't pick that lock. Like, okay, well then, fine, I'll try to, I don't know, blow it off the hinges. Oh no, it's magic and it's super powerful and you can't blow it off its hinges. It's like, okay, well, what can I do, right? Like, so that's a communications issue is fundamentally what it comes back to. So much of playing comes down to how much we can explain what we're seeing and trying to each other. So a specific example of intent and approach is going to come back to interacting with NPCs. So the situation we have today is there's a guard and a note. You want to get the note, but between you and the note is a guard who doesn't want to let you through the door. So how do you get past the guard? Right? So I'm giving you the intent. You want to get past the guard to the note. How do you get past the guard? Any ideas? This is interactive. You got to answer me. Bribery? Invisibility? Stabbing things? That's burning them alive? That's flirting. That makes more sense. It's like, all right, I'm hard of hearing. I'm sorry. Listen, based on your group last night, burning them alive was not all that far out. So there's a whole bunch of options, right? You could distract them, you could drug them, you could have somebody else try to bluff them or deceive them, whatever. So how does that situation change if I describe that guard as brash and young? They're kind of like they're pumped up and like they're ready. How might like bluffing them work, right? You try to like tell them like if you don't get out of the way, I'll talk to your superior, right? Is that likely to work on like a young 20-something guy who's like really got a lot to prove? Probably not. What if they're old and ready to retire, right? Maybe that's the guy to push the buttons on because he just, you know what? I don't even care. Like, it doesn't even matter. Or it could be like he's an old man who's about to retire and he's like, you know what? What are they going to do? Make me retire? And so then like, now you're dead, right? Like that could be a problem. What if they're nervous and suspicious already? Like there's a whole lot of things that change. So this is the danger of miscommunication. If all I give you is that, you don't have enough to go on, right? So me as the ref, I have to give you more. But you also need to ask for those things. You need to try to get the information back to let you know what the right things to do are. How does this tie back to work? Delegating. The delegation of work in problem spaces is a defining trait of senior skill level. I don't care about titles, that's not what's important. But the skill level of somebody who you would consider senior in your organization, delegation is a critical core competency. This requires the accurate communication of shared mental models, right? If I understand a problem in like a certain level of detail, I know how to solve it, I know what the right thing to do is, but you're a junior and I want to explain it to you and I want you to be able to take this thing over. It'll take me 10 minutes and you 25 minutes, right? But it's good for you to learn, you're going to grow out of that. I need to explain it well enough for you to do it. So what I don't do is send you off to do the 25-minute task that takes 2.5 hours, right? Like that's a failure mode on my part as the senior. But it also means I have to be able to hear things that are coming from elsewhere in the organization and synthesize that information properly to be able to disseminate to the rest of my team and to act on, right? So a lot of this comes back to seeking clarity and confirming. So a good technique for this is, what I understand you said was blah, 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 blah. Don't say blah, blah, blah to your boss, though. Like actually like the right thing, right? Like the actual synthesis. A couple examples of this is, who here has ever written a script or implemented a tool somewhere? Yep, all the hands. Okay, so when you do that, chances are there's a lot of communication involved because you have to find out what's the requirement, what are you trying to solve, why does this thing have to exist, what are the risks, who's going to do it, who's going to maintain it. Then you have to explain all that. How do you use it, right? Has anybody here ever written tools other people have had to use? Yeah, so that requires a lot of communication. Fixing a bug. How many people here have gotten a bug or a ticket that says it's broke? Like just that, right? So like, what's it? What is broke? Or you get something that's like, I can't access the share. The share? Which share? This share? Okay, the share, the finance share. So these are cases where communication is going to come up and be hugely important, and we all deal with it all the time. Improving this skill is one of the things that your employer and your bosses are looking for from you. It's one of the things that sets you apart from other people in your organization, right? And it's a skill that applies no matter what you're doing, no matter where you're working or what you're working on. So the next skill is empathy. So empathy is all about a shared mental model. We talked earlier about communication was sharing that mental model that you already have. Empathy is about building a mental model of another person, especially their feelings, perspectives, and goals, right? So this is kind of what role-playing is, right? So you are taking the place of a fictional person in a fictional world. They don't exist. They're not real. At least we know they're not real, right? Okay, so this is kind of that fundamental skill, right? So you have to put yourself in that person's place. What would I do in this situation, right? What is the right decision to make? How would I feel? What do I think? But not just for ourselves. This is also the critical thing to understanding other people's choices and decisions, right? So not only what would my character do, but what would an NPC do, right? What are they thinking? What's their reasons for this? And so a good example of when this comes up is when it's time to unravel a plot, right? So there's been a betrayal, okay? So the army was out, they went out east, they were supposed to fight the enemy army, they got beat. It looks like somebody betrayed them. Somebody told them where they were going to be at the wrong time, they got ambushed. There's a couple of suspects. You have a war minister who you know is greedy and jealous, the king, who's tired and cautious, the prince, who is scheming and proud, and then the general, who is pragmatic and loyal. So you know somebody betrayed them, and you've been asked to figure out who it is. What reasons did they have, right? How do you suss this out? How do you even begin starting this if you can't build a mental model of any of these people, right? If you can't try to begin to figure out what their reasonings could be, you can't even investigate usefully, right? So maybe you know that the war minister is greedy and jealous. Maybe this is a good opportunity. Maybe they were bribed. So you think, okay, they're greedy and jealous. They don't like the king or the prince. They seem like a pretty likely candidate for being flipped. Maybe it's the king, though, right? The king knows long drawn-out wars are expensive on the treasury. They take a lot of time. They bleed the country of resources. They foment rebellion. We'll just lose the fight early, go to peace negotiations, get it over with. Maybe it was the prince. He thinks if he can make the army lose, right, headed up by the general, maybe he can take the crown. Maybe he can earn a little bit more respect, right? Or maybe it's the general who knows, like, we're going to lose the war. It's better if we lose fast than lose slow. But you can't begin to work on any of this unless you understand the types of things that drive humans. And so role-playing games are a really, really great way to practice this skill in a super safe environment, right? If you misunderstand why a coworker is upset with you, you can really screw that up. If you misunderstand why the prince is trying to take down the army, like, okay, well, new game. Or you kill the prince, it's whatever. This comes back to customers and coworkers, right? You can't effectively build any systems without understanding the people they're for. And the thing to keep in mind here is that every line of code is written for somebody, right? It all goes to somebody. Even internal-only code, right, is for your team. Like your patch management system, that's for your operations folks, right? That's important. And it's important to them that it works the way that they expect it to work, when they expect it to work. Troubleshooting also requires understanding where your users are coming from, right? If you can't put yourself in the shoes of the customer who is trying to do something, you're going to fail. You just will, right? Like it's hard to understand how they made a mistake. And so even if you find the bug and you fix it, if you can't think like that, you'll keep building systems that they will break in predictable ways, right? When you get this information, this is a system telling you something, right? And your ability to kind of predict that through empathy is going to go a long way to helping you understand what your systems are doing right and wrong. Also, fundamentally, our work in operations and infrastructure requires empathy, right? We touch huge amounts of people across our entire organizations. Telecom we don't think of very often. I talked about earlier as like a critical infrastructure in my last talk. If telecom goes down, sales can't do their jobs, finance can't do their jobs. Things start to foul up really, really fast at your organization. So even fundamental, like little infrastructure stuff, you need to think about how it affects other people. What your on-call cycle looks like really matters. A lot of this is going to come back to, and you can see me afterwards for like a long, drawn-out discussion on this, building better systems at work, building more just organizations. I'm really passionate about something called restorative justice, and to learn more about that, you can pick up the book Just Culture by Sidney Dekker, and that'll be in my resource slide at the end when I put these up on the internet. But yeah, empathy is the core skill that we need to be focusing on and practicing, especially as engineers, we tend to downvalue this. So what does empathy feed into? It feeds into collaboration. It's really hard to collaborate without empathy, but collaboration is fundamentally your ability to work with other people towards shared goals. They don't have to be perfectly shared. You don't have to share all your goals, So let's talk about this in D&D, right? So there's a cast of characters we're going to use for this example. You've got a wizard. They want knowledge and power, as wizards do. Warrior wants glory and challenge. They want to be known as the baddest of badasses. That's what they want. And then there's a thief who, as we described earlier, is all of us. We want that filthy, filthy lucre. We want to get out with cash. And then there's the priest who just, I would really like to go home at some point and retire. I would like that. If I could have that, that would be good. So let's talk about surviving the dungeon, as a few of the people in this room will remember from last night. But we'll do another example. So there's an old temple. It's inhabited by a cult and a demon, and there's these weird monsters that start appearing in town, right? They start seeing these things come up. So if you try to work through an old school dungeon, any dungeon really, but old school dungeons in particular, without cooperating, you're going to die. You just will. It's going to happen. But the thing is that dungeons require multiple skill sets and multiple specialties. Like, you're going to come up to a problem sooner or later that you can't just slingshot to death, Tam. Despite trying really hard. It's just like, I hit it with my slingshot. Nothing happens. Okay. But you're also going to come up against, you're eventually going to come up against a door that you can't open yourselves. You need somebody to pick the lock of, right? Or you're going to come up against something like, maybe you should try to talk your way out of it. Very often those varied skill sets are going to give you options that having one set of skills won't. Right, but not only are there varied skill sets and specialties, but there's also threats and goals, right? So we know that inside of this dungeon there's these wandering monsters, there's traps, there's the factions, there's the cult and the demons and stuff. But we know that the wizard wants to find a tome. There's a kick-ass book of magic in there, and like the wizard's like, yeah, all the cult stuff, yeah, but the Black Lightning book I kind of need. And then like the warrior's like, yeah, oh, that's fine, but I would really like to kill the demon. Demon Killer seems like a great title to have on my resume, and I kind of want it. The thief's like, yeah, that's all great, but like big jewels. I need to take those home. And then the cleric's like, you guys are kind of... Listen, there's a village that's being attacked by monsters. Could we solve that? So they're going to have to figure out how they're going to work together, right? So maybe the wizard says, hey, listen, in the room with the book, there is also a killer sword. Like, I was reading about it. I'm pretty sure this is the way it is. I'm certainly not lying to you, warrior. You help me get the tome, you'll get a sword of demon slaying. Conveniently left in the place where there are demons. So they said, okay, well, we'll go get that together. And the thief says, yeah, but first help me get the jewel, because I know that you're going to have to pick a lock to get in there. And you don't know knock, which is the spell that opens doors. So you're going to need my help. You want my help? Get me the jewels. And the cleric's just like, if I could just wrangle you guys for like 10 minutes, maybe we could survive this. So they're going to have to make these concessions with each other and try to figure things out by working together and by sacrificing a little bit on what their goals are and trying to get them to come up together. So how does this rely to work? This comes back to being a senior. And I have senior in quotes here because, again, I don't care what the title is. What I mean is the person in your organization who has graduated on from individual contributor without leadership qualities to somebody who is leading in some fashion, right? And this is important because you can lead from any level in your organization and at any level of technical ability, really. The most technically proficient engineer working alone is always going to be outperformed by 3 mediocre engineers collaborating effectively, right? And the reason that this happens, and we know this because Google did a study, I'm going to try to dig it up and tweet it out later. The reason that we know this is that problems don't scale linearly with your intelligence. There's a certain level that you can get smarter and solve problems faster, and then past that, you can't just add more brains to it. It just doesn't work, right? The problems are going to start to continue to ball out of control and just snowball and get bigger and more problematic and more tangled. And one person can't keep building on that, right? No matter how smart you are, no matter how technically proficient you are. It turns out parallelizing workloads is really good, like really good. And so that's where teams come into play, right? Here's the other thing. When you're managing your individual goals, how many people here know that the things they're doing at work are what's best for them and for their department and for their team and for the overall organization, right? When you're making a decision about how to spend your time, like, I'm going to work on PowerShell. That's definitely what my boss's boss wants me doing, right? Anybody? It's not perfect. So I only figured out when I was writing this talk that that tension that you feel between doing what's best for you might not be what's best for your team. What's best for your team might not be what's best for the department maybe not the organization, and vice versa. Like what's best for the organization might be you putting aside PowerShell and working on some other stuff for a little while, right? That tension that you feel, that's a lack of alignment. So I heard my bosses say for forever, we got to align things. Everything needs to be aligned. We got to get alignment. We're going to drive alignment. And you're like, stop saying that word because it doesn't mean anything. Well, it turns out it does mean something, but they never said this. Like I don't know, maybe I'm just the dumb guy in the room, but I never put that together, right? So fundamentally, collaboration is alignment, right? The ability to drive towards a shared goal together, right? And it's not permanent, it's not forever, because it's always contextual. The other thing here is that we're always trying to do our best to do right? We're never going to be perfect. We're never going to be on top of everything. What we struggle to do is make sure that we're doing the most right thing that we can right now. And that's collaboration. So you figured out how to collaborate. One of the problems you're going to run into is resource management. So this is your ability to analyze and effectively allocate, effectively is important, your available resources to solve problems, but not just now, also in the future, right? Resource problems aren't just always point in time. So Dungeons & Dragons, we have something called spells per day. You don't need to know anything about Vancian magic or that stuff, except that the way that this works fundamentally is that you hold a whole spell in your head, and then whenever you're going to cast it, you just let it go. You do that final trigger, and you let it go, and it burns its way out of your brain. So you can only hold so many at a time, and once they're gone, they're gone. Right, so now you have to decide, what spells do I prepare, and which ones do I spend, right? So which ones am I going to cast when? So what if I prepare fire spells, and the only thing I fight are, like, fire demons? Like, that seems like a really poor decision, right? Like, but I don't necessarily know before I start my day. What if I don't prepare fire spells, and we fight plant monsters, and I'm like, water. Or better, milk. That would at least help. And then which spells should I use when, right? Like, so even if I prepared the spells, should I use like my really powerful spell now, like the one that's going to fill up the whole room? Like, I'm fighting one monster. Maybe I should hold off on it, but am I ever going to fight like 30 monsters? Hopefully not. Hopefully I've avoided that problem. You don't want to get mobbed. And what if you need the spells later? And like all this kind of comes down, it's more complicated than binary yes, use, yes or no, right? You're always going to be making trade-offs, and that's fundamentally like what resource allocation is going to come down to. So, specific example we use today is healing. So that warrior from earlier got injured in the Temple of All Dooms. So you have a choice now as the cleric. You can heal the warrior now, and maybe they'll start the next fight at full hit points, and everything will be happy, right? They're fully healed. They're not like dying, by the way, I should point out. Like they're hurt, like they're limping a little bit, but they'll survive for now, hopefully. So you could heal them now. You could wait a while and see if they need healing during the next fight. What if, for example, you heal them and the thief now gets stabbed, right? Now you're out, you can't heal them anymore. Like, well, thief, guess you're going to bleed out. I'll take those jewels, though. Do you seek alternative resources? Maybe you can find like a wand of healing or something, or you have healing potions or something. But here's an option that we don't often think about. In addition to the things you have, there's also the option to do something like retreat, right? The ability to pull back and change tactics is a resource you have. Right, so they don't need to stay and fight. They could pull back out of the temple, heal up a little bit, come back. And the problem, of course, is that once you've shown up, the cultists know you're there, right? They're ready for you time two. So there's always going to be those trade-offs when you're making these decisions. And there's a reason that I didn't put an answer on this slide is because there isn't a right answer, right? There's a bunch of options. So what does this look like at work? Looks like team capacity. Hands up if you don't have too much work to do. Okay, hands up if you have too much work to do. Yeah, okay, so your team is presumably made up of people. Anybody not with a team with people, like dogs maybe? Okay, so they're people, they've got skills, they've got interests, they've got availability, right? All of these things are kind of a confluence there. You got more work than you could possibly do, even with everybody running all at the same rate. So you need to figure out how to best spend your time and effort to affect maximum impact. So this kind of comes back to that collaboration part, right? You got to decide what's the right things to work on. But not just that, who's the right people to work on what? So a good example everyone in this room has probably dealt with is how much time do you allocate to tech debt versus your automation efforts versus like the ongoing tickets? Does anybody have like a set perfect answer for this? No? Okay. Let's think about it in terms of, let's say we have a 5-person team, right? There's 5 days in the week, there's 5 people. This is maybe going to break down okay. Let's say we say we're going to do 20% is going to be on tech debt, 20% on automation, and 60% we're going to do for our ongoing ticket work, right? So how do you do that? Maybe you have 5 people. You just say, Glenn, you are now doing tech debt. Tam, you're doing automation. And then 3 of you are going to do the ongoing ticket work. It's great for Tam. All she has to work on all day, every day, is the scripting. Doesn't have to talk to customers, doesn't have to deal with any of that. Glenn, on the other hand, is stuck every day fixing bugs exclusively. Probably ones he's never going to write now because he's just fixing Tam's bugs. So she also doesn't have to care about QA anymore. Just, whatever, it's Glenn's problem now. And then there's the folks who are doing the ongoing ticket work. So they never get a chance to go in and look at the code and try to improve their skill sets there or keep up with those things. So that's probably not a good one. So what if you do a rotation where you say, okay, every week we're going to rotate slots, right? So you set up 5 slots, and so Tam starts out and she's in the fun slot over in automation, and Glenn's in the bad slot over in tech debt, and you've got the other 3 kind of in the middle. So Tam moves over. The next week she's going to be doing tech debt. Glenn's going to be in ongoing for 3 weeks, and the person who is in ongoing is going to move over to automation. So you can rotate through those. Or you could do stuff that's like, okay, well, we've got 5 days. Everybody has an assigned day where they do automation or they do tech debt, right? And then they don't have to write a ticket queue that day. There's a bunch of options here. The point is, this is really, really hard, right? Resource allocation is hard. Team management is hard. Figuring out the right things to do is hard. So what could possibly help with that? If only there was a skill called lateral thinking. So this is your ability to problem problems with many, many approaches. This is a meta skill. Like, this is one that builds on top of everything else. It's really important, though, because it's the one that we use all the time, and this is the one that people actually think of when they think of like engineering skills. So in Dungeons & Dragons, we have something called the solve or die problem. And for those who played last night, this story will be familiar. So there is a door, and in front of this door, a stone bar, right? And this stone bar has 2 iron pins on either side that hold the bar. And as you raise the stone bar, right, the pins go chunk, 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 chunk. So what you could do at that point is stop, look around, try to figure out what's happening, look up, see that there's a giant hammer about to swing down on your head, and decide, hey, let's put the stone bar down. You could be like a certain person in this room and summon a spirit beaver to chew through the bottom of the door. That's certainly an answer. And then you could come back around because you want your warhorse with you, see that it's a trap, acknowledge that it's a trap, and decide to set it off anyway, and then get smushed against the door. So this trap is a high danger, low failure tolerance, and we experience these things at work too. So what I mean by high danger, low failure tolerance is if you get hit by an 8-ton sledgehammer that falls from the ceiling, you're gonna die, right? Like, that's the end of your day. Was the door open? No, they had chewed a small hole in the bottom. Oh, no, the hammer does open the door afterwards. It's also an effective way to open the door. It just sent their bodies into the room. Yeah, everybody, yeah, the horse survived. Right, they went back to open the door. They'd already gotten through it. Anyway, the point is, there were a couple options that they didn't even think of. Like, they could have used a pole to lever the thing out of the way. They could have held the pins down, and that would have worked. They could have disabled the hammer once they noticed it. There's a bunch of options that you have here. But they gambled and lost. They didn't really think laterally about the problem. So this also comes up in patterns and experience. In that same dungeon, there are these coffins in which there are these clay snake men, and if you touch one, a puff of poison gas goes into your mouth. That's not tasty. You don't like it. It makes you cough and kind of blink. So the thing is that sets you up. So you see coffins, you see these clay creatures, and you expect after the first 3 or 4 get you, if it takes that many, that maybe I stop putting my face in coffins, which not a lesson you think you have to teach people. Turns out it is. But the thing to point out here is that it's the patterns and experience part, right? Like, when we're working in operations, we'll very often know that something's wrong with a system, but won't be able to articulate quite yet what it is, right? You can just see that there's something in the logs that's incorrect. Kind of sets off that alarm bell. What that is your system's mastery is kicking in. You know the system well enough to be able to anticipate a failed state or a problematic state, and that's a good indicator to go investigate. So a really specific example here is the jelly skelly. This is a lateral thinking exercise for the whole team. So this is an impervious undead. The jelly skelly is a skeleton, as you might guess from the name, covered in a thick orange ooze. It has functionally infinite hit points. You could stab it, beat it, shoot it, blow it up, burn it, whatever. It's going to come back. It cannot be killed. So, how do you stop one? You freeze it. Say? Trap it.
Yeah, push it into a hole.
Push it into a hole. Burn it. Burn it won't work. It'll keep coming back. Well, maybe. You got to get it hot enough. Like hotter than steel beams. Make friends with it. Yeah, you can sing to it, as Tam will do. If she's not slinging stuff, she's singing. That sounded like a trust. You could retreat. That's also an option. So yeah, there's a whole bunch of stuff here. I've had players, they previously removed its legs and kept those so that it would crawl after them. Their reasoning was like, well, it crawls slower than we walk, so we see it coming and just keep going. Last night, our players were like, hey, how can we, maybe because they're being chased by a strong, terrifying creature, and they turned around and they were like, I'm going to throw nuts at its feet, like acorns. And so I was like, okay, fine. It's going to try to save. It's going to see how maybe it slips and falls or whatever. Crit fail. So it falls right off a cliff that's hundreds of feet. Big boss monster, no fight, and they're just dead. Which is a good thing, right? If you can solve a problem laterally in the first 30 seconds, that's not a failure state. That's a victory condition, right? So we're going to bring it all home now and talk about troubleshooting, which I know everybody's super excited for because it's your most fun part of your job. So troubleshooting kind of uses up all of the skills that we've learned so far, right? So we're going to start with what went wrong. So you're going to need to get bug info. You're going to have to try to understand what that person was doing when it was discovered. This is going to require a lot of communication and empathy, right? You need to understand what happened to lead to this condition, and you need to build up very quickly and clearly a shared mental model of what happened in the environment, what the environment state is right now to be able to move forward. This is hard, right? So let's say you figure it out. You know what went wrong now, right? You know that the web server stopped serving requests, okay? Just because you know it stopped serving requests doesn't mean you know why, right? You can know the end state without knowing what actually the problem is. So how do you investigate, right? You could run tests, you could check logs, check reports, you could probe things, run commands on the machine, try to figure out what's happened. One of the skills that you could use, you could try to narrow things down from broad chunks and then kind of zoom in. So you say, okay, well, is it a network problem? Can I hit the thing from there? Okay, well, no, it's serving up content locally, so it's not a, it's clearly got to be a network problem, right? So you've narrowed that scope of what could be broken down. This is really, really going to build on top of your systems mastery and your communication, because again, you're constantly updating everybody who's in on the outage with the shared mental state. Empathy, you're trying to understand how the system was built and why. You're collaborating because teams, as it turns out during an outage, have different desires, right? So the desire of the networking team is that it's certainly not the networking team's fault. It is not us. And storage is feeling the same way, and then the application developers are like, us? And then meanwhile, we're like, it's clearly not us, right? Nobody wants to be at fault. There's that tension, but then there's also the tension of we want to solve the problem fast, right? So trying to get everybody on board, the person who's hurting right now is the customer or the end user, right? And making sure that you put them forward when you're doing your investigation is important. But also documenting everything as you go, trying to figure it out. You have limited amount of people on your team that can investigate a problem. Who's the best person to put on it, right? Is it sensible to assign your database person to look at the networking issues? Probably not. It's probably not the best use of their time. So you're going to have all those things, and it's also going to come back down to this lateral thinking thing. What can you try? What can you investigate? What can you probe? What are the possible things that it could be? So let's say you figure it out. You know exactly what the problem is. So now that you know the problem and you know what caused it, how do you fix it, right? There's only ever one perfect, proper solution for every problem, right? Yeah. So you could roll back, right? So if it was a code change that did it, you roll back to the older version of the code, or maybe you do a quick fix now and you circle back later, right? You just do an immediate patch, you do a triage, if you will, and then come back later. Maybe you do a full restore of 90% of the functionality. You're just okay, we don't actually care that this thing's broken. It doesn't actually matter. We investigated, it's not that big of a deal. We're just gonna get to 90% functionality because this thing's deprecated anyway. Let's not spend the effort. This, of course, as you might notice, is going to require enough information about the system to understand why and how to make these calls. You need to be able to communicate with everybody involved, including stakeholders. You have to understand how everybody's going to feel about it and what the impacts on everybody's going to be. You need to be able to collaborate because, again, there's that tension, right? The app team doesn't want to be told, your app isn't that important, we don't care, right? That's not what they want to hear, and it might be true, right? If it's an internal app that is functional enough with this piece broken, you just do the smallest bare minimum patch, that might be true. It might not be effective for your organization to spend 3 or 4 hours for the next 2 days working on this thing. But you have to understand that and take that into account. Again, you have limited resources to work on the fix. All of this stuff's going to come into place. You kind of see how all this stuff builds on itself. So let's do a quick review here. These are your meta skills. These are the 6 core meta skills that you have that feed everything you do, right? Absolutely everything. I can't think of a single thing I do at work that doesn't require one or more of these. Not one ever, right? And then even outside of work, how many people here have friends? Well, friend, you can have one, at least one. Your cat does count, right? You got to have empathy for your cat, right? If you don't understand that they want to kill you and take your food, you'll misunderstand what's happening with your cat. So this stuff comes up all the time across everything we do at work, across everything we do at home. These skills are skills that you take with you everywhere. So with that in mind, here's the thing. You don't win at D&D, right? There's no victory condition for a tabletop game. You also don't win at life, and you don't win at your career. There's no end state. There's no final boss after which the game is over. That's a really, really, really good thing, right? Like, that's awesome, because it means that you still have room to play, right? No matter what happens, there's always more to do. There's always more to explore, more to see, more to change, more to experience, more to grow. You're always going to improve and solve new problems, right? You're going to build better teams. So here's the thing. You're gonna get to a point where your tech skills, where your technical skills in a particular domain, you're going to top out, right? You're going to end up as Jeffrey Snover, right? At some point, you're going to reach as high as you're going to go on the technical scale of a particular domain. So what do you do at that point? You change domains. That's one of the best options, right? But it could be, so maybe you go from doing operations, you've been a senior operations person for 8 years, and you decide, I want to try QA, right? I think there's a lot to learn by switching over to QA. Or you switch over and you say, I want to do development, which is what I did. You can switch between all of these focuses in the area, but you could also switch entirely. Maybe you've done all of this and you've been in healthcare, right? So you switch over from healthcare. If you don't think there's any differences between healthcare and agriculture, probably in for a lot of a culture shock, right? Or you go from like healthcare to like gambling. That's a real different one. There's always a place to change, but the thing is those meta skills will follow you. You'll be able to do all kinds of new and different stuff in those places. And I think one of the things that's really going to help us is that those meta skills will keep improving over time, and you'll become the person who makes teams more successful, right? You'll be able to skill up everybody else in your party and make them a better party everywhere you go, no matter how technically competent you are in that domain. And that's going to be a phenomenal game changer for you personally and for your careers. I've found it to be very fulfilling to be able to do this. So that's all I have for today. I've got culture links on the next slide. The last thing I want to say is that tonight at Tavern Hall, I'll be running a game of Macchiato Monsters, which is a Dungeons & Dragons hack. Anybody and everybody in this room is welcome to come and join. I can run for probably like 15 people at a time, 60 minutes in a block, not that big of a deal. So if you're interested, if this is like piqued your interest, you want to give it a shot, whatever, reach out to me, follow up with me afterwards. I'm happy to run for games for you here or afterwards online. It doesn't matter to me. That's it. Yeah, so the question is, how do you manage people who either don't have empathy at all or who have poorly developed empathy skills? So part of this, it's kind of a little bit of a facetious answer initially, right, is empathy, right? You try to understand where they're coming from. The longer answer is that sociopathy is a really difficult subject. Some people really don't have any control over it. Some people just haven't invested in the skill. It's going to require a lot of one-on-one work in either way. Sometimes this requires managing up. Sometimes it requires like leadership across. Those things are difficult. It's always on a case-by-case. I'd be happy to talk afterwards about like the particular troubles you're having or whatever. I can't really give you a silver bullet answer, but I forget every time I do a talk, but if you could rate this talk, especially this one, and let them know, because this is one of the few like pure culture talks. Like you might have noticed there wasn't a whole lot of PowerShell in there. I'd really appreciate it. I'd like them to let me do this more. I can keep talking about Dungeons & Dragons pretty much all day. Yes? Like the workflow type material or Dungeons & Dragons material? Okay, so the question was, can I recommend conferences that cover more of the culture stuff? Yes. So culture is one of the pillars of DevOps. So if you can get to a local DevOps days, you'll see a lot more talks like this. Next year, they're splitting the conference tracks into like 2 broader groups. So the DevOps and Automation Conference will have a lot more of this type of content, I think. This is something that I've been really passionate about for a while. because I think that culture is really, culture and workflow is the harder thing than the tooling, right? Like the tooling is impressive and it's really important, and like the people here who talk about it are way smarter than I'll ever be. But I think like these cultural problems, the same reason that these meta skills are so important is the reason I think we need to talk about it and elevate that amongst engineering folks. So I'd also be happy to give you recommendations for your local area afterwards if you want. Yeah, that definitely does help. So the comment was around trying to get your organization to do more training around these skills and the effectiveness of it multiplying, which, I mean, that was kind of the point, right? Is teams are better than individuals, right? That still applies even when they're talking about these skills. So if you can get your organization to do that, to buy in, great. If you can't, there's some grassrootsy stuff you can do around getting other people interested. So that might be another option. I know not everybody's able to like tell HR, like, you need to do the right thing. It's a hard conversation. Any other questions, comments, concerns? Who wants to play D&D tonight? Yep, you're all in. Congratulations, you passed the process. Ooh, that's another question. Who here wants to write a chapter in the PowerShell conference book? You're in. Glenn, listen. I saw you put your hands down. So yeah, so we're also doing the PowerShell conference book, and we're doing, after the conference wraps up, Warren and I will be back on our PS Power Hour stuff. So we do twice monthly community lightning demos. So I want to reach out and encourage any of you to submit any talk for that you want. You're totally on board for it. I think I'm out of time, but nobody's come in to like kick me off stage yet. Oh, it's a half-hour break. That's why nobody's here to kick me out. Perfect.